Thank you. Thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon at the school that until 4 years ago my daughter was at in the sixth form, so a fantastic school it is too. And it was entertaining that attention, the meeting should have been brought to order with a whistle being blown, because one of the stories that I tell that's not related to Brexit is about when I was about 5 or 6 years old and was at school in Derby, and I think probably there's perhaps one person here who may, looking right at the back there, who may remember what schools were like in those days. And, what happened was that a friend and I decided that a really good idea would be for my friend, not me obviously, for my friend to blow a whistle in the middle of playtime in the playground. Because of course what happens in those circumstances, of course, is that all the children fall into line ready to go back into school. And for our privilege, or for the privilege of proposing this idea and executing or completing that particular task, we were both brought into the headmaster's office. And although I pleaded it wasn't me who blew the whistle, it did happen to be my idea, we both got caned for it. Now, your teachers may have views about whether caning is a good or a bad thing, but certainly when I was at school, that was still an option that was available to teachers to punish pupils who behaved badly in school. So what I'm here to talk to you today about is, first of all, being a Member of Parliament. Why did I become a Member of Parliament? I became a Member of Parliament in 1997, so I am the longest serving Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament. So anyone who is in their early 20s now and has lived in Carshot and Wallington for their whole lives will only have had me as their Member of Parliament. I was elected at a period where there was a huge change politically happening. So before 1997, there had been a series of Conservative governments, with Margaret Thatcher as the Prime Minister, and then in the last 5 years John Major. And then in 1997 everything changed on a huge scale. In other words, there were hundreds of Conservative members of Parliament who lost their seats, and hundreds of new Labour MPs, and a large number of Liberal Democrats elected as well. So I was elected at that point. I am now the longest serving Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament, so there's no other Liberal Democrat who has been in Parliament as long as I have. There are some who were elected in 1997 who lost their seats in 2015, which was a catastrophic year for us as a party, but they got re-elected in 2017. So Ed Davey, who's the MP for Kingston and Surbiton, I don't know whether any of you come from Kingston and Surbiton, he's now again your Member of Parliament, having been re-elected in 2017, and also Vince Cable, if any of you come in from Twickenham, he was also re-elected in 2017, having been out of Parliament for a couple of years. Now, why did I get involved in politics? I got involved in politics because in the early 1980s there were some things happening. First of all, there was Margaret Thatcher as our Prime Minister. Margaret Thatcher as a Prime Minister was someone who was very much a Marmite character. And what she did was she got a large number of people involved in supporting the Conservative Party, and she got an equally large number of people involved in supporting any party but the Conservative Party to try to counter what she was doing at that time as a Prime Minister. And that's why I got involved. I was very unhappy with the things that she was doing. For instance, the fact that the whole of the mining industry was shut down in that period without really any preparations made for what was going to happen to those communities afterwards. If you look at the Brexit result, there's actually a very clear correlation between the places where mines were shut down, and in many cases communities have never quite recovered, and the places that voted Brexit. So there was a clear correlation, I would argue, between those two things. So I wanted to get involved, rather than perhaps just screaming and shouting and ranting every time Margaret Thatcher came on television. I thought the way to deal with this is actually get involved and try to campaign against her, and therefore in 1997 I was able to benefit from that huge political swing of the pendulum that saw so many Conservative MPs lose their seats. And we then had 13 years of Tony Blair 11 years of Tony Blair as Prime Minister and a Labour government, with a very large majority. What is quite unusual about what's happened since 2010 is that neither the 2010 government nor the 2015 nor the 2017 governments have had large majorities. And that's why in 2010, for there to be a government, there was an agreement between my party, the Lib Dems, and the Conservative Party to form a coalition government, which I would argue delivered 5 years of stable government, something which is in rather big contrast to what's happening at the moment. In 2015, David Cameron was elected with a majority, albeit a small majority, and therefore there were some constraints on what David Cameron could do. And then, of course, after the referendum result, or sometime after that, when our present Prime Minister, Theresa May, triggered a general election for the purposes of securing a more comfortable majority, that had the opposite effect in that she lost the small majority that she had, and is now dependent on the DUP, which I would argue is without a doubt the most reactionary party in the UK Parliament. And those of you who are thinking, for instance, when you get into arguments about first past the post and proportional voting systems, where you're thinking, well, of course, first past the post is the best thing, it always delivers strong and stable government, will reflect on what first past the post delivered in the general election in 2017. It delivered a minority Conservative government that was dependent on the DUP, the most reactionary party in the UK Parliament, to deliver its programme. And of course, that agreement has very much come unstuck, and that's why the government now have huge difficulty in getting through any of their programme, and most specifically the Brexit programme. Now, Brexit, for the last 2.5 years, has eaten up all the government's time, all the government's resource, all the government's energy. And that means that virtually everything else, transport, health, education, the economy, skills, training, has had to take a back seat whilst the government have put ministerial energies into dealing with Brexit, but have also put civil service energies into delivering Brexit, and indeed a lot of government money into delivering Brexit. Increasingly, in recent months, government money being spent preparing for something called no deal. Now, there are some, Sir John Redwood, for instance, who argues that no deal would be fine. There wouldn't be any problems associated with no deal. I think he needs to think again. He needs to look at the technical notes that his own government have produced that set out what the impact of no deal is. And the impact of no deal, some of the preparations that are being made for no deal at the moment involve digging up the motorways on the approach to Dover. They involve converting what was Manston Airport into a large lorry park. They involve the Department for Health becoming the largest purchaser of fridges, apparently in the world, and that is because they are having to plan for a scenario with no deal where they would have to stockpile medicines, and the pharmaceutical companies have built up a stockpile of 6 weeks' worth of medicines, just in case the large number of medicines that come from France, Germany, Spain, Italy and so on do not get here in time as a result of a no-deal scenario. And some government commissioned reports recently have confirmed that in a no-deal scenario, trucks could get stuck at Dover for 6 days. That's not me saying that, that's the government's own analysis saying that is one of the possible impacts of it. And for a company like Honda, Toyota, Nissan, who make cars here which are exported all around the European Union and employ tens of thousands of people, and associated industries employ probably hundreds of thousands of people, they operate just-in-time operations. What that means is they do not have a big warehouse in their manufacturing plant which stores all the parts they need to build a Nissan or a Honda. What they do is they have that car running along the production line, and almost as it's moving along the production line, the truck arrives, offloads the components, and they get incorporated into that car almost as it's going along the production line. So you can imagine what's going to happen if the truck with the components that need to go into that car is arriving 6 days late. What it does is it shuts down the factory. And it won't need to happen too many times if what the government are predicting could happen in a no-deal scenario. It wouldn't have to happen too many times for that company to decide, maybe building things in the UK is not that good an idea anymore because we're having to shut down our production line every now and again because the parts aren't there, whereas the parts that are going to a factory in the Czech Republic or the Netherlands, they haven't got these problems with trucks getting stuck at borders, so instead we'll start manufacturing them there. Or the next time we have to make a substantial investment in new plants, and we're looking at, do we invest in a UK plant to build that model, or do we invest in a plant somewhere else in the EU? I think we can be pretty certain where they're going to choose to make that investment. So Brexit has locked the government down. They have allocated something like £4 billion to prepare for Brexit. Apparently the government have no money. When it comes to Brexit, it seems as though money is no object. And we also had our Secretary of State for Transport, hopefully some of you have followed this story, a couple of weeks ago, the Secretary of State for Transport, Chris Grayling, the MP for Epsom, he decided that it would be appropriate to award a contract to 3 companies, a French, a Danish company and a UK company, and these contracts are being awarded so that if there is no deal and Dover gets gridlocked, that these ferry companies can bring extra ferries into other UK ports so that the trucks, rather than get stuck at Dover, they can bypass it and go through another port. He thought it appropriate to allocate £14 million to a UK company, which is a start-up company, which has no ferries, to a port which at the moment can't actually take ferries, and it hasn't done for a number of years. So that is the madness, I'm afraid, that is Brexit and the way the government are handling it. I'm sorry if anyone came here thinking, and I know there's at least some Conservative Party supporters in here, thinking they were going to get a balanced argument that was going to give you the pros of Brexit and the cons of Brexit. I'm afraid I can't think of many pros of Brexit. I can think of rather lots of cons in terms of Brexit, and having been the party's spokesman in the last 18 months, I can assure you I could speak for a very long time about many more of the cons than I'm able to do in the short talk that I'm going to give you today. So perhaps I should conclude, because I know that the real value of these things is to give you a chance to ask me questions, but just to say that whatever you feel about politics, I think politics is something that is fundamental to our country. It is something that enables people to deliver visions. You may have views, and I'm sure you do, on a whole range of issues, strong views about what you think should happen in this country. But one of the best ways of making sure that happens is to get involved politically. Doesn't matter which party, obviously I prefer it with us, but it could be with another party. Getting involved, shaping legislation, making laws, determining where we're going as a country. And so I know politicians get a bad press, but overwhelmingly, virtually all of the politicians I've met from a whole range of political parties are in it because they think they have a vision that can deliver something positive for the United Kingdom. Obviously, for different political parties, it will be a different vision. So I hope many of you will consider a political route, becoming a Member of Parliament, or indeed representing a local council, representing a local area. In many ways, particularly if you're a councillor, you may have more of a say in what's happening locally than, say, a Member of Parliament who happens to be an opposition Member of Parliament, because those first 13 years in Parliament, which I had from 1997 to 2010 with Tony Blair as Prime Minister and a Labour government, frankly, it was quite frustrating to be an opposition Member of Parliament, because when you have a government with a majority of 200, frankly, the opposition can scream, can shout, and wave flags, but it doesn't actually make much difference, certainly in terms of what's happening from a government point of view. But so sometimes you can deliver more, and I know that people, friends of mine locally who are councillors, feel that the contribution they're able to make in terms of shaping the agenda in Sutton is often perhaps greater than that an opposition member of Parliament can do. So I think I'd better finish there, and hopefully there are lots of questions. I've kept it nice and controversial, hopefully to stimulate some response, and I won't discriminate for or against members of any other party supporters, so feel free to stick your hands up, and I hope someone's going to want to kick it off. Yeah.
So you brought up the fact that with Brexit the government put aside £4 billion. Do you know that's less than 1% of the government's money that they get from tax revenue? So does that change your opinion that such a big event going on in the UK needs that much money?
Okay, well, what you also need, so the question was, does it matter that the government is spending £4 billion because it's not very much compared to the government's total spend? What you also need to look at is the long-term effect of Brexit on the UK economy. And the UK economy means job opportunities for you. Because if, as the government's own analysis suggests, whether it's Theresa May's deal, no deal, Norway, if that's an option they now start examining, all of those options mean that the UK economy is going to grow, and this is the government, not me, the UK economy is going to grow more slowly than if we had stayed in the European Union. And an economy that is growing more slowly means fewer job opportunities, and it means less money available to spend on public services such as schools, hospitals and public transport. So it's not just the £4 billion that the government are spending currently, and that won't be the end of it, I can assure you. It's also what we are going to lose in terms of economic potential and the permanent knock-on effect that has on everyone's opportunities here. And again, for you as young people, if you want in the future to go and live, work and study in another EU country, until we leave the European Union, you can be guaranteed that you could do that. Once we have left the European Union, there's absolutely no guarantee that you'll be able to go live and work and study in another EU country. So that is also something, an opportunity that you will be losing if we leave the European Union.
Well, Theresa May's withdrawal agreement has been particularly divisive, to put it lightly. What would the Liberal Democrats do if they were currently in government power?
Well, so that's, what would we do if we were in power? Well, setting aside the fact that if we had been in power we would never have initiated the referendum in the first place, but obviously we are where we are now. And thank you for that. First of all, for us as a party, we do not think that it is possible for the Prime Minister to secure a deal that is better than the one that we currently have as members of the European Union, and the government's analysis, as I said earlier, confirms that. All of the options of Brexit they have considered leave us poorer than if we had continued to stay in the European Union. So that is why we've come to the conclusion, because we are where we are, that we now need to put in a people's vote the Prime Minister's deal and give people a choice between backing her deal, which she says is the best one that's available. She's just spent 2.5 years working on it. You can't get anything else, according to her. Put that to the people, and in return they could also have the option of voting to stay in the European Union. That is what we were arguing. That is what I argued with the Prime Minister a couple of days ago when she came for the first time since the Brexit process started. For the first time she came to talk to a cross-party group of MPs about what we wanted to see happen on Brexit. I think that reflects the fact that they are now in a state of crisis. They have ignored, basically they've ignored half of parliamentarians, and they've ignored just under half of the people who voted in the referendum until a couple of days before this critical vote on the Tuesday, because they thought that they could decide all of this internally within the Conservative Party, and now she has realised that is not possible. Now, with very little time, less than 80 days to go, she is now reaching out to try to secure support from other parties. Had she done that 2.5 years ago, when we offered to work with her, she might have secured a different outcome, but she didn't. She tried to contain this within the Conservative Party, which is a minority party in government. And therefore it was incredibly unlikely that she was actually going to be able to secure a deal that had a majority support, because her party isn't even in the majority in the Houses of Parliament. So we want a people's vote so that people can have their say, so that young people who are 16 and 17 who did not have the chance to vote in the referendum 2.5 years ago, who overwhelmingly backed staying in, would have the opportunity to vote in that referendum, and I suspect the outcome would be different. Right at the back. Right, so the question is, how do we respond to the challenge that, in fact, there was a vote 2.5 years ago, the will of the people was expressed 2.5 years ago, and we should not be in the business of asking the people for their views again? Well, my answer would be that the referendum took place more than 900 days ago, and the evidence from the polls is that the will of the people has actually changed. So the question then becomes, should we allow the people to have their say now that all of the evidence points to the fact that people's views have changed compared to what it was, their view was 900 days ago? And it's perhaps not surprising that people's views have changed, because of course 900 days ago, in the run-up to the referendum campaign, there were people who were going up and down the country saying, well, of course, the European Union will give us everything we want because we're a very big country, very important, and therefore everything we want from a deal, we will get it. Well, it hasn't quite worked out like that. They also promised, as you'll remember, £350 million extra a week for the NHS. Well, in a Brexit which leaves the UK economy smaller than it was before, very hard to see where £350 million a week is going to come from unless you actually take it from somewhere else, because we have an economy that's growing more slowly than would have been the case otherwise. So I suspect that money, if indeed that money materialises at all, will be coming from other budgets. It won't be coming from an economy that's been growing more quickly had we stayed in the European Union. So I think the will of the people is not something that is fixed in time. I mean, had we got to the point of deciding to leave the European Union 5 years from now, are we saying that the decision taken 2.5 years ago, in other words, by then 7.5 years before, was the decision we had to deliver, and it's not possible for anything to have changed in the interim? I don't agree with that. 900 days ago was a long time, and what has emerged, of course, is that when people voted 900 days ago, they were voting for this simple, a relatively simple proposition of do we want to be in, do we want to be out? And frankly, nobody, and I include myself in that, nobody had a particularly clear understanding of what out would look like. Because there are 101 different flavours of out. There is the out that is, in effect, we cut off all relations with the European Union, and we end up in a relationship with the EU that is very similar, say, to the one that Chile has with the European Union, or we end up in a relationship which is much, much closer to the EU, like Norway, which is out of the European Union, but is very close in terms of its connection with the European Union. So nobody really knew what out meant 900 days ago. Now I think they've got a reasonable picture of what it is possible for the UK to negotiate, and what it is possible for the UK to negotiate is what Theresa May has negotiated, and frankly she has managed to unite Brexiters and Remainers in agreement that her deal is a very bad one for the United Kingdom. Right, who else has got a question?
A few years ago you were an assistant government whip. Do you think that breaks are necessary in minor parties, and have you ever had a situation where you had to go against your constituencies to support the party?
Okay, so yes, I was both the coalition government and also a whip, both the chief whip for my party, so responsible for ensuring that my MPs voted the right way as far as possible, and also for sort of more pastoral care. That's what a chief whip does. So has there been perhaps a time when I've been out of step with my constituency? Well, people would argue that in some respects, certainly, I would argue it has changed in the last few months, but that my position in relation to Brexit is out of step with the constituency, and that the constituency in 2016 voted to leave by relatively small margin, but voted to leave. What I would argue is that as a Member of Parliament, I'm elected to represent my constituents, but at the same time, we are elected as individuals who have views. I have made it very clear since I first started campaigning here in 1990. No one since 1990 can be in any doubt that I am someone who believes that we're better off in the European Union. And therefore, for them to say, well, it's outrageous that you are now still willing to campaign to stay in the European Union when your constituency has voted to leave, I would argue Members of Parliament are often being attacked for being unprincipled and blowing with the wind. Well, I'm not blowing with the wind. I have held this view since 1990, and my view, I would argue, has been even more reinforced by what we're experiencing in terms of membership of the EU is beneficial, and therefore I should continue to campaign in favour of it. So equally, I'm sure there are a number of constituencies around the country where if you polled people for their views on the death penalty, you will probably find there are some constituencies where people are in favour of the death penalty, but you will find very few Members of Parliament who will advocate being in favour of the death penalty, because we don't believe collectively that it is a sensible and just way of dealing with serious crimes.
Democrats were formed by an off-group of the Labour Party, the SDP, and the Liberal Party coming into a coalition. Do you think that in the modern political climate, something like that would happen again, where you have offshoots of the Conservative Party or the Labour Party coming to form like a pro-EU group? Something like that?
What is certainly possible is that as a result of Brexit, that the Conservative Party and the Labour Party may well split. It depends on what the outcome is. But if, for instance, Jeremy Corbyn, who is a lifelong Brexit supporter, if Jeremy Corbyn decides that he is going to help the Conservative Party deliver Brexit, then he will split the Labour Party. There will be a group of Labour MPs who walk away at that point and say, well, we've tried changing your position, Jeremy. You decided to proceed with Brexit, something that we think is going to get in the way of all of the things that you want to achieve, for the reasons I stated earlier in terms of shrinking an economy. If you want to put more money into public services, you do not do that by shrinking the UK economy, and that is what Brexit, I think, will do, and that is what those Labour MPs think will happen. Equally, if the Conservative government, as the Prime Minister threatens us with on a regular basis, says, well, if you don't accept my deal, then we're going for no deal. If she insists on no deal, then she will split the Conservative Party. There are already a number of our cabinet ministers who have said, if we proceed with no deal, we're out of your cabinet, because they know what the consequences are. So there is the real potential for Brexit to exacerbate the fault lines that exist within both of those parties. Whether it will lead to a new political party, I mean, the UK political system is rigged against new political parties, because we have a first past the post electoral system, which means that to elect a Member of Parliament, you have got to have, in each constituency where you want to get someone elected, if you have not got, say, 35% of the vote, you're not in the running. And new parties are very unlikely to have very concentrated levels of support in a relatively, in any number of constituencies. What they might have is support that's spread out fairly evenly, and you could end up with a situation where a new political party emerged, it got 20% in the general election and it did not get a single seat. Because in the strong areas for Labour, they will be getting 40% of the vote, so you lose. And in the strong areas for the Conservatives, they'll be getting 40% of the vote, so you lose. So you end up having, and this is what happened with the SDP alliance in the 80s, where that party, we got close to, I think it was 26%, and I think Labour got 28%. Labour ended up with, I think, 200 seats, we ended up with 20. So that is the way our political system works. So it's very hard to see how a new party could grab the different MPs that I am working with, and I'm not going to name them to share them the embarrassment, but there is very active cross-party cooperation from people on the centre of the Labour Party, the Green Party, the SNP, Plaid, Labour and the Lib Dems and the Conservatives working together to try to ensure that we have a people's vote, and overwhelmingly to try to ensure that if we get that people's vote, that people vote to remain in the EU and we cancel this harebrained project. So, I mean, I'd love to think a new party is going to emerge, but that new party is going to face the problems associated with first past the post, and there aren't very many examples recently where parties have managed to make that breakthrough. In other countries, it's much easier. In other countries, where you have a proportional system, you can get, a political party can get 10 or 15% of the vote and can very easily end up in coalition with another party because they have got 10 or 15% of the members of that parliament elected to represent them. That's not the system we have here, unfortunately. Yeah.
Criticise first past the post and how, like, a minister talks about Brexit, but in the proportional system, I don't know if multi-member constituencies and like maybe a coalition government won't also hinder the process, so like what's the point of changing it?
Well, so if the questions are there some downsides to proportional systems, clearly, for instance, Israel and Italy are often produced as examples of proportional systems where you end up with quite a large number of smaller parties where perhaps it could be argued that those very small parties exercise a distorting influence on the whole of the political process. I mean, you can get round that by having thresholds so that a party can only get seats elected if, say, 5% of the population vote for them, so you do not end up with 25 political parties, all of which, or some of which are getting 1 or 2% of the MPs in that parliament elected, and then becoming part of the government. I think that would be very bad for politics, and that's why I think you would need to have some sort of threshold to ensure that you didn't end up with a situation where a coalition was dependent on one party with one MP which had some quite extreme views. But as I said earlier, we have ended up in a position in the first past the post system where the Conservative government are dependent on the DUP, who have some rather strong views about gay rights and some rather strong views about, for instance, whether women are entitled to an abortion. And I don't think their views reflect the mainstream views in the United Kingdom. Right at the back there.
I was going to ask, like, if there was a second referendum and we did vote to remain in the EU, like, how do you think the relationship would change after the EU? Like, do you think it'd be detrimental?
Yeah. Okay, so how would well, first of all, as the party's spokesman, I have done a lot of ringing round of different EU politicians. We have lots of parties in the European Union that we have they're sister parties, so parties that we have a relationship with, many of which are in power in different parts of the European Union. And overwhelmingly, in fact, without any exceptions, they have all said, if you manage to get a referendum and if you vote to remain, we would love that. That is what we want. We do not want the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. I was talking this morning to a Polish politician who was saying, please, anything you can do to get a referendum, vote to stay in. What we do not want in Europe is to be left with the French and the Germans fighting it out between them. We want the UK there to provide an alternative view and another partner that we can work with. So overwhelmingly, the EU wants us to stay in. However, there is no doubt whatsoever that they have lost trust in us as a country. And they have lost trust in particular with the Prime Minister. Because the Prime Minister has gone to the European Union, sort of agreed something, and then come back here and said something completely different, and tried to then unpick the relationship that she has, or the deal that she secured with the European Union. And this deal, in effect, is an international treaty. And you don't just tear up an international treaty and say, well, actually, we change our minds, because in terms of the UK's reputation, you know, the countries that tear up international treaties, they tend to be Russia, China. We do not want to be in the same boat as them. We want to, I think, you know, stand up for international values, and observing international treaties is one of those. So the idea that she will come back here and say, as she has done, to some of the Brexit supporters, well, look, we will seek to tweak that. Well, the European Union doesn't think we'll seek to tweak that because they've just spent 2.5 years negotiating that with us, and they believe that we have signed up to that, and it's now down to Theresa May to try to get Parliament to agree to it. But that is the agreement the UK has with the European Union. Right. Who hasn't asked a question? I haven't asked a question.
I have enough.
Yep.
Because the Lib Dems is now a minor party,
Yep.
do you think it's possible for them to ever see a resurgence, and how would it be
Okay,
possible?
so the helpful question is, now the Liberal Democrats are a minor party, do we see the possibility of a resurgence? Well, to some extent that's down to the voters, who they choose to vote for. And what is very clear from the polling is that, for instance, if Labour helped deliver Brexit, there will be a substantial number of Labour voters who desert the Labour Party and come and support the Lib Dems. That is what the polls are saying. However, I would much prefer that we stop Brexit than we benefit from having Brexit and getting voters come to our direction. So I think the British, one thing about the British political situation at the moment is that it is very fluid. And that I think that what is happening in terms of Brexit is so seismic in terms of the impact that it'll have not just on the country, if we go ahead, but also on the different political parties, that the political system could break up. And certainly, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the two political parties, the major political parties that have occupied most of the political ground in the last sort of 60, 70 years, could splinter, and then who knows what's going to happen in terms of the future. So we're not in a situation like we were, say, in the 1950s, where I think it was only 2 or 3% of people voted for parties that were not the Conservative Party or the Labour Party. We're in a much more fluid position where if Brexit leads to the breaking up of other political parties, we might benefit, we might not, a new party might emerge which might benefit, who knows where it's going to go. We cannot predict literally from the moment from one day to the next what's going to happen. So I can't predict what's going to happen if the Prime Minister calls a general election. I can't predict what the outcome of that is going to be, and I don't think any of the political pundits would seek to do that either. Yeah.
What's your opinion on grammar schools?
What's my opinion of
Grammar schools.
grammar schools?
Yeah.
Well, my opinion of grammar schools, it'd be a bit difficult for me to argue against them, given that my daughter went to this one and my son is still at one locally. So, I mean, what I want to see is, first of all, the decision-making about the make-up of schools locally left to local councillors. That's my view, that's our position. Local councillors are the ones who are elected to represent local communities. They have the best, in my view, the best grasp on what those local communities want, and if they decided they wanted to maintain grammar schools, that is what they should do. If they decide they didn't, then I think they should be entitled to do that.
So I know some people who believe that even though the public are smart when it comes to voting in referendums or politics, they're not so. And you're also saying how people have changed their will now. And even though I agree, I see that as in the public made a mistake. So my first question is, how are you so sure that the public won't make another mistake? And then my second question is that the people who voted for Brexit now participate in the referendum. They have to vote for Brexit, even though they don't want it. So how do you believe that they'll make a clear-headed decision when doing so?
Okay, well, first of all, I don't say that people who voted for Brexit were wrong. And I've never said, as often Brexiters accuse Remain supporters of saying, I've never said they were stupid. The people who voted for Brexit did so for a large number of very different reasons. Some of them it was about immigration, probably the majority of them was about immigration. Some of them it was because they saw that the red bus said there was going to be £350 million for the NHS, and they thought that's exactly what we need. For others, they felt that their views hadn't been represented. And so a lot of the people who voted in the referendum are people who had never voted before and voted in recent decades. So there are lots of different reasons why they voted to leave. But as I said, I think the polls now do suggest, because what we've had in the last 900 days is more attention focused on the European Union and what it does and what it doesn't do than we've had in the whole of our political history. We have spent the last 2.5 years identifying that actually things like tackling crime, we are part of something called the European Arrest Warrant. The European Arrest Warrant is something that enables the UK to get back from another country, a country like Italy, if there is someone who is suspected of terrorist offences in the UK, using the European Arrest Warrant, we can get that person back to the United Kingdom much, much, much more quickly than was previously the case. And the same is true, there was a period where Spain and the Costa del Sol was the place where all British criminals went to retire, because it was very hard until the European arrest warrant was introduced to get them back to face justice here. So we've had this discussion about what the advantages of the European Union, and yes, of course, some of the disadvantages of being in the European Union. But the level of awareness of the role that the EU plays in terms of, for instance, ensuring that we have common standards around medicines in the EU, that we have common standards around aviation safety, that we have common standards around the safety of chemicals, that we have a system in place, the Erasmus system, which I hope you might still be able to benefit from, that enables students to go and study in other EU countries. All of these things are things that we have as a result of being in the European Union, and things which frankly did not probably get much exposure until we started this whole process of debate after the referendum rather than before, which is when it should have happened, and have been able to, in my view, counter some of the more trivial and often very inaccurate stories that were put out by leading Brexiters like Boris Johnson in relation to things like, the EU requires a banana to have a certain curve and a strawberry to be a certain shape and colour. Things that he repeated again and again and again, both as a correspondent when he was working in Brussels, and much more recently during the EU referendum campaign, which were frankly lies. And he, as an intelligent person, knew that they were lies, but he was quite happy to carry on peddling them. So I think there is no guarantee that the result will be different. But for me, as someone who is fully committed to trying to ensure that we stay in the European Union, if after having had this 900, by the time the referendum takes place, if there is one, it will be 1,050 days of debate about the merits or otherwise of the European Union, if at the end of that process people still think, well, I think that we're better off out, then I, as a strong Remainer, have to accept that people have seen the evidence to a greater extent than was available before. They've made a decision which I would say was much better informed, and the evidence that they've had and the information they've had about the EU has been much more accurate. But if they vote to leave, well, that's the decision they've taken, and I'm not going to be campaigning for there to be another referendum.
You mentioned a couple of times sort of the big red bus and the effect that it may have had on the voters voting for Brexit. Say we do bring in this sort of second referendum, how can you ensure that the same mistakes won't be made and the rise of sort of populism won't come into effect again and then cause even more sort of debate as to whether the referendum is still valid?
Yeah, very good point. So how do you ensure that if we do get into a campaign that it is of a better quality? And we have got some ideas, and I'm pleased to say that the broadcasters have got some ideas about that. So the broadcasters' idea is that they will run during the course of debates, certainly you'd expect there to be debates, when people are politicians on either side or other campaigners. It might not necessarily be politicians at the front of the next referendum campaign. In some respects it would be better if it wasn't. But they will actually fact-check that live. So when a politician says, or a campaigner for Leave or for Remain says, well, if we leave we'll get this, then they can fact-check it, and actually in the middle of the debate run a ticker line along the bottom of the screen that says actually that can't be substantiated, and do the same thing for any claims made by a Remainer during the campaign. So rather than those arguments often being rebutted, but 3 days later, it'll be happening during the middle of the debate. And it'd be great, for instance, if they could introduce that in the United States and do it when President Trump is speaking, because obviously that ticker will be going all the time, every time he opens his mouth, in terms of highlighting the things that he was saying were untrue. So I think what I'd also like to see is a commitment from the different campaigns, and I've already drafted something, in effect a charter, that would say that both campaigns would agree to get their facts fact-checked by organisations that both camps recognise as being independent, impartial and suitably informed, so that we would commit to basically only saying things that have been cleared, in the way that if you place an advert, you can't place an advert for an energy drink that says if you drink this you'll run faster than Bolt, for instance. You'd have the same sort of process that stopped the campaigns making outrageous lurid claims such as if we stay in the European Union, every single inhabitant from Turkey is going to come and live in the UK, as Boris Johnson said. Any other questions? Well, he didn't quite say that, but there's that was sort of the allegation or the illusion. Yeah.
What do you think it will take for the FDP?
Sorry?
What do you think it will take for the FDP?
Well, what do I think it will take for there to be a people's vote? Well, the critical thing is that Parliament, or a majority of MPs, have to agree to it, and then the government have got to make time for the legislation for it, and that is critical, because what we've found in literally in the last week is that Parliament, so a majority of MPs, can agree something, but if the law doesn't say that is what is going to happen, it is very hard for a majority of MPs to make it happen. Now, it's causing me to reflect on our parliamentary democracy when you have a system where a majority of MPs cannot force the government to do something that a majority of MPs want to happen. So we have to arrive at a point where the government and the Prime Minister wants this to happen, and I think, as I said a few moments ago or earlier, she, I think, is going to come to that conclusion because her deal is going to get defeated on Tuesday. No Deal Parliament have already said we do not accept no deal, and she will have cabinet ministers who will leave her cabinet if she tries to force that through. She cannot go back to the European Union for other negotiations because they've said you've had your time, you've done the negotiation, you've got the deal, that's the only one that's on offer. So what option is she left with apart from saying, well, okay, my deal I think is good, Parliament doesn't like it, but I like it, I want to test it with the people, you asked me to deliver this, I think I'm delivering the will of the people, here it is, you can vote for that or you can vote to stay in the European Union. I think she may come to that conclusion herself, and interestingly there have been unofficial sounding outs of MPs and other parties by the government about their views of what a people's vote would look like and how it would work. So it looks as though they may be moving in that direction.
If the people did vote Remain again in a second referendum, which sort of deal would the Lib Dems support?
Well, if people voted to remain in a second referendum, then we are staying.
I need to leave, sorry.
Well, if they voted to leave, well, I mean, the thing that, I mean, we will not vote in favour of the Prime Minister's deal. And the assumption would be that in a people's vote, if we do get a referendum, it would be the choice between the Prime Minister's deal and staying in the EU. There's absolutely no way we are going to support her deal because we think it's fundamentally a bad one for the United Kingdom. We think the best deal that is on offer is the one that we already have in the EU, so why would we want to support something that we think is going to cause us harm? So we would campaign very actively to stay in the European Union, and the critical thing is that if we do secure this, we now have a legal judgment, which I was involved with, a court case that went to the European Court, which has confirmed that the UK can stay in the EU if we, in effect, cancel the process. We can stay in on exactly the same terms as we are now without any changes at all. So if people vote to remain, then it's as if none of this happened, and what a dream that would be. Yeah,
what's the main problems that are facing your constituency of Wellington?
Okay, what are the main problems that are facing my constituency? Well, it's probably fair to say that Brexit, because it's a slow burn and a long-term effect, probably isn't the biggest thing that's facing my constituency. It probably is in a number of other constituencies where they have a big Honda, Nissan, Toyota, Siemens plant, where they are, or Ford plant, where they are very worried about the impact of Brexit, but obviously we don't have any of that in Carshot and Wellington. I would say the biggest issue is probably the future of our local hospital, St Helier Hospital, which I'm pleased to say has had, in the last 12 months, has had more investment put into it than at any point since it was built in the 1930s. It just had just under £30 million spent on it, so that's a good sign. But it still needs a lot more in terms of making it fit for purpose. I think probably for people locally that is a big issue. Clearly, at certain times of the year, accessing school places is a huge challenge because Sutton, as you'll know, is a borough that has, compared to lots of other boroughs, quite a complex mix of schools in terms of comprehensive, selective, girls, boys, Catholic and so on, which means that if you, depending on where you live and depending on your faith, depending on whether you do or do not pass the 11+, your opportunities for a school place are quite challenging. So that's a really big issue for people locally as well. Yeah.
I think this will have to be the last question.
Okay, you're lucky. You're the last question.
I know a great many of your constituents are enraged, to put it simply, about bins in your business. Do you intend to do anything to fix this problem, which I know plagues a lot of people?
Yeah. So, for those of you who don't live in Sutton, but if you live in Croydon or Merton or Kingston, you may well be experiencing the same thing, because Veolia are the same contractor who are providing the services in those 4 London boroughs. Veolia are not performing well, there's no doubt about that. They got penalised they have been penalised each month where they've not met their standards. They've had 10% of the money that they should be getting docked from them, so they are paying a price for it. What Sutton Council is doing at the moment is engaging with them to see whether, between the two of them, Veolia and Sutton Council, they can agree that the council will put in some more money, and that Veolia equally will put in some more money, just to make sure that the service standards are raised. Before Veolia came in, bins was a minor, almost non-existent part of the casework that I had to deal with as a Member of Parliament. Since Veolia took over the contract in April 2017, it has been a major part of my probably the largest part of the casework that I've ever had to deal with. So it's something that I'd love to see go away, but I think the only way it's going to go away is if Sutton Council and Veolia between them agree that a little bit more money has to be spent on it, so that issues like the litter collection, this is a very exciting subject, the litter collection system is one that is based on, they no longer have a road sweeper who comes round on a regular basis. They will go out if they identify that there's a problem in a particular location, which means unfortunately that someone can leave a bottle in the gutter, and if they haven't been round and spot check that road, under the old system, within 2 weeks it will be gone. Under the new system of spot checks, that could be there for a very, very long time, and that's not something that I find is acceptable, including residents don't either. So on that upbeat note about bins, thank you all for the chance to speak.